Hello and welcome back to episode 20 of the One United podcast. I'm joined as ever by Henry. Henry, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. You?
Yeah, I'm good. Very excited for this one with a very special guest, joined by Kieran Maguire. Kieran, are you all right?
I'm sound, thanks, lads. Thank you very much.
Brilliant to have you on. So, if you somehow don't know who Kieran is, he's a university lecturer, we found out, and he's also an author. He's wrote the book Price of Football. It's a very interesting read if you any football fans want to go and pick it up. But yeah, we'll get into it then. So, basing this episode around sort of football finances, you sort of got to when you've got the expert in the house. So we'll kick it off with United's finances. And the obvious question that a lot of people are going to want to know is financially, what went wrong with the Jadon Sancho saga from your sort of perspective?
Ultimately, the two clubs couldn't agree on a price. So Manchester United are probably losing around about £4 million for every home game, which doesn't take place at Old Trafford due to the lack of ticket sales. So I think the club hierarchy have been cautious in terms of what they're prepared to spend in the transfer market. There were rumours that they put in a considerable bid, which I think would have made Jadon Sancho the most expensive player in the club's history. But that still didn't match the valuation given by the selling club, who themselves are, whilst lots of people say, well, they lost money this year. But they've lost money in 2020 for the first time in 5 or 6 years. So actually, their finances were pretty good. It's one thing when a club has to sell, you can normally negotiate them down. When they don't have to sell, especially when it's Manchester United who are the buyer, we are seeing clubs put up a lot of resistance in terms of prices. You've only got to look at the Harry Maguire sale, where Leicester didn't only get their requested price, but they got it all in one instalment, which is unheard of these days in terms of major football transfers.
Yeah, it's definitely a frustrating one, Henry. Do you, like, from a fan point of view, sort of what's your frustration towards the Sancho deal? Obviously, it's unknown whether the finances were even there in the first place, which we'll go on to next. But sort of what are your sort of feelings towards us not getting that over the line?
So I think there's frustration from every single United fan, that we didn't get it. It was a big deal that had to kind of get done one way or another, really, whether that included players going the other way or, but Dortmund weren't willing to accept. So at the end of the day, there's not a hell of a lot you can do when your club doesn't really want to pay the price that they've said it. They say it's not realistic in the COVID market. I can kind of understand that, but at the same time, it's United. People expect big transfers. But yeah, I'm sure we'll go on to the reasons why United couldn't. I'm sure COVID has had probably a bigger impact on United than most clubs. So yeah, it's not good, but it's kind of understandable in these circumstances.
That sort of brings us on to my next point then, Kieran. Obviously, COVID had a big impact on every club. You're saying, though, that United probably weren't as bad off as they were saying they were. We obviously heard the big news a couple of months ago that they took out a £140 million loan, I think, to sort of cover the operating costs. So when you factor everything in and you factor that, they spent upwards of €40 million on Amad Traore, who's not really a proven talent at all. They then, they still spent a considerable amount this window. Where was there ever the finances to go and get Sancho, or have they just sort of spent it elsewhere and covered themselves thin?
Ultimately, the club values a player at a particular price, and if the asking price was higher from Dortmund than Manchester United felt the player to be worth, then the deal stops there, and that's the case with all transfers. I think United attract a greater amount of publicity than practically any other club in the country. You could argue Liverpool are pretty much there as well, and therefore they get exploited to a certain extent by other clubs who know that United are trying to be box office all the time. they spent a fair amount of money in the market. It's not for me to say that they've overpaid the players in the past, because that's not really my area of research. But their history in recent years, I guess people might say, was mixed. The likes of Di Maria and Pogba, who came in on big sums and left relatively quickly. And that might be where perhaps the United hierarchy are now being cautious, that they're looking to recruit players, not only who are good players, but whom they can sell at a profit at some point in the future, should that prove to be necessary. And that could have been linked to the 110, 120 million euros being demanded by Dortmund for Sancho.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting point, Emery. I'll sort of come to you as well. Do you think that the financial power that we've sort of displayed over the last couple of years, and you could say somewhat money mismanagement, is now coming back to bite us now that times are sort of tough?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the club spend a little bit more when we don't get top four. That seems to be a kind of a trend for me. I think Kieran will probably go into the finances better than I can, but it seems to be the case that they don't spend as much money when we're inside the top four, because at the end of the day they're there for finances. The Glazers are there for the financial reasons, not because of the club itself. They're there because it's a money making machine, and as long as they get something out of it, then I guess it doesn't make a difference to them. So in terms of transfers and stuff, I don't think we can't really do anything. So at the end of the day, it's down to the board and the owners to either appoint someone to do the job, or we keep going the way we're going.
This sort of brings me on to my next point then. Obviously to Kieran, from your knowledge, there's a lot of speculation around fans and major news outlets as well about how poorly this club's being run by the Glazers. But from a sort of expert point of view, is it as bad as everyone's saying, or should we be sort of cutting them a little bit of slack?
When you take a look at a football club, there's two things that you've got to balance. There's sporting success versus financial success. Now, there are some clubs for whom financial success is a complete non-issue because of the nature of the ownership models of those clubs. So I think the two prime examples in the Premier League for that would be Chelsea and Manchester City. They're both owned by people who are independently wealthy, who can afford to lose money through running a football club. Chelsea have had spectacular losses. City have been breaking even in recent years, but I think we'll probably come to that story a bit later. When it comes to Manchester United, they are trying to strike more of a balance. I think Ed Woodward's words of a few years ago, which I suspect will haunt him until his dying day, was along the lines of, we don't need to win football matches at Manchester United to be successful, along those lines, because of the commercial success of the club. And those words have been thrown back at him ever since he said them, every time Manchester United don't win a trophy. Manchester United have the biggest wage bill in English football. So to say that the Glazers aren't investing in the squads simply isn't the case. If you take a look at the gross spend since Sir Alex Ferguson retired, so we've had 7 full seasons now. We've got gross spend of 142, 151, 167, 205, 243, 103, and 162 million pounds. So that was up to the end of June 2020. So the club has invested in players, even when you take out the sales of players such as Di Maria came and went, Romelu Lukaku came and went, and so on. Fellaini came and went. The net spend prior to this summer's window was 870 million pounds. That's a huge amount of money. That's certainly up with any other club in the country during that particular period. So they have spent the money. have they spent the money well? I'm not a Manchester United fan, so I'm not qualified to really say whether or not that's the case. One of the other things that they've done since Sir Alex retired is that when they have signed players, quite a lot of the time they've signed those players on credit. So at the end of 2019, Manchester United still owed £188 million to other football clubs for outstanding instalments on transfers. So I think fans sometimes get confused. They see a player being signed and they think that money's already gone, but that's not the case. So therefore, when it comes to this summer, Manchester United already had huge amounts of money committed to leaving the club in respect of transfers from previous years. You throw in COVID into the equation, so you've got a lot of money which has to go out. You've got the wages, which are £25 million a month. And remember, Manchester United haven't made people redundant. They haven't used the furlough scheme. I spent most of my life living in Manchester. They've been one of the biggest private sector employers in the city. So they've done things which other companies of the same size haven't done. But so you throw that into the equation. They didn't have a limitless amount of money to spend on players this summer. They've still spent a considerable amount compared to some other clubs. And on the back of that, I would say from a financial point of view, the club is run solidly. I mean, you can point to the £826 million that's been spent on bank interest since the Glazers have taken over, and so well, surely that would have been better spent on the playing squad, or perhaps better spent on the infrastructure. As somebody that goes to Old Trafford as an away fan, I look around. I think it's looking a bit tatty and dated, and things like that might come to be regretted, I think, by the hierarchy, because that's going to prevent them from getting money in the future. So their finances are solid. You've got to give credit from the financial point of view to the commercial department. I know some people will say the commercial department sometimes are dictating matters on the field in terms of pre-season tours and trying to players having to go and sign, to have their faces next to your noodle partner or your track partner or whatever, and that distracts away from the football side of things. But it's also generated the money which has allowed United to go into the transfer market and also outbid players, outbid other clubs when it came to wages. If you think about David De Gea signing a new contract at Old Trafford, he was certainly tempted to go back to Spain, but Manchester United put together a remuneration package which was so attractive. He's decided to commit effectively the rest of his career to the club, assuming he sees out his contract.
Yeah, it's a very frustrating one, isn't it? That I think I'll come to you, Henry. Obviously, we talk about the wages and we talk about what Kieran said earlier about Ed Woodward's his quote saying, we don't have to do well on the pitch to be a success. As a fan, it's obvious how frustrating it can be, but just sort of how bad are the emotions that you feel hearing these words that are coming out of Kieran's mouth?
Well, it's tough, but I always compare it to other ownerships in the Premier League, and the consistent theme is that every other club seems to be, the owners are putting money in, not taking money out, and it's frustrating. Obviously, I used to live down in Brighton, so I know Tony Bloom runs the club down there in a fantastic way. He invests a lot of his money, and you can see the stadium there and stuff. It's all kept up to date. And then, as Kieran mentioned, Old Trafford is sort of, I wouldn't say falling apart, not to that level yet, but it's certainly outdated, and it's frustrating to see. I do have a question quickly for Kieran, and that's regarding the takeover. Whether you think it was kind of ethical, because obviously there was debt immediately. They took out a loan essentially to buy United, and now the club's saddled with debt. So I'm just wondering what you think of the takeover in the first place?
Business and ethics don't really accompany each other in the same sentence on a regular basis. What happened with Manchester United is what's referred to as a leveraged buyout, whereby somebody comes in, puts in relatively little to a takeover deal themselves, and effectively borrows the money secured on the company it's acquiring's assets. So that was the case of Manchester United. It's not any more ethical or less ethical than what happened at Manchester City or Chelsea or Liverpool. It was just a different style of model. I think what was frustrated the critics of the Glazer ownership is I think only one of the siblings is a football fan, realistically. They are picking up, Manchester United are paying dividends now of a fairly constant £22 million a year. That clearly frustrates fans, and they say, well, what have the Glazer family done to deserve the lion's share of that? I think you could also say, what's Alexis Sanchez done to deserve his salary for the last couple of years at the club as well? So fingers can always be pointed. United fans seem very frustrated. Last year they made the semi-finals of the Europa League, and they finished third in the Premier League. If that had happened to my club, I'd be doing cartwheels. So football is more competitive than it was pre-Abramovich and pre-Mansour. And I think perhaps United fans need to take that into consideration. Liverpool have turned themselves around. I think the Liverpool Moneyball model, which they've used for player recruitment, is incredibly well developed, and they've been willing to adopt new technologies and embrace new ideas, where perhaps United have been slow out of the blocks. So I think there's operational issues at United which could have been done better. As far as the ownership takeover is concerned, it's a terrible thing. Business is business, and the Glazers saw Manchester United as a business which was underperforming, and you've only got to look to see what's happened to the commercial arm of Manchester United since 2005 for that to be the case. And they have been very successful there, and they've made a lot of money on the back of that in terms of the dividends they take, potentially salaries as well. We're not able to see who receives salaries, but I think salaries could potentially be taken as well. So it's been very successful for them. It's been very successful for the bankers, and if we're honest, until 2013, until Sir Alex retired, it'd been pretty successful for Manchester United on the pitch as well. It's only since his departure that I think the expectations of Manchester United fans haven't been met in terms of the level of on-the-field success. And if you're unhappy about on-field performance, then you start to look for somebody to take responsibility for that. And the Glazers are a valid target. They've not put money in, as you correctly said. A lot of money has gone out to third parties in the form of the banks and the shareholders, who don't seem to have invested much emotionally into the club, and on the back of that, they will be castigated by the fans. I was teaching at Manchester Metropolitan University for a fair time, and one of my colleagues was involved in setting up the constitution of FC United of Manchester, which is and he said he'd been a lifelong Red, and he couldn't take it anymore. So the fact that some United fans were prepared to go that far is indicative of the strength of feeling. I think that there has been rightly or wrongly, that has been a lack of organisation between the remainder of the Manchester United fan base to really make the Glazers think twice about their actions.
Just to sort of stay on that sort of line of of thought then. You say there's no sort of emotional connection there at all between the Glazers and the shareholders and United. So, they're under no sort of moral obligation to sell. And I think financially they're doing very well out of the club, so they don't really need to sell at all. So, there's a lot of fans saying Glazers out, Woodward out, and it's probably in a way justified. But do you ever realistically see them selling the club or leaving in any sort of short period of time?
Ed Woodward is, as far as a chief executive has done, he's delivered what the owners have asked him to deliver. So I think he's probably just as frustrated as anybody else, because he does go to the games. And he must be wondering at times, we spent X million on that player, and he of course will know the wage. We only speculate on wages. He'll know exactly what some of those players are earning, perhaps not really getting a good return from that investment. Could they sell? Yes, certainly. If somebody came in today and offered the Glazers £4 billion for Manchester United, they take it. But nobody's come in with an offer of that nature, and part of the reason for that is that if they were looking from a business perspective, Manchester United don't deliver a huge return on £4 billion in terms of their profitability. So you'd only be getting, we take a look at United's profits. They're relatively small. If they don't qualify for Europe, then you've got the lack of Champions League money to factor in. You've got potential rebates or deductions in terms of sponsorship money. So it's quite a high risk business. So if I was an investor, I'd be saying, well, what's in it for me, apart from the kudos of owning Manchester United, and that has clearly got to be huge given the club's global reputation. But there's not a huge financial incentive to take over the club, to pay, I think, the type of money that the Glazers would be willing to sell it for.
Oh, I've just got one more question, and then I'll hand the floor to Henry, because I know he's got quite a few. It sort of goes back to what you were just mentioning about when United do and don't get European football. Now, I've done a bit of research this summer as well into it. I think a lot of United fans have, and there's a clear sort of distance between the net spend of the Glazers when we qualify for Europe compared to when we qualify for the Champions League, compared to when we don't qualify for the Champions League. So every year we go into the Europa League, there seems to be a huge increase in net spend compared to the Champions League. Do you think this sort of says anything about the type of leadership we've got, about, it's purely financial gain for the Glazers rather than seeing a club do well?
I hope that isn't the case, because I would expect a club of the magnitude of Manchester United to have a player investment strategy which goes beyond looking at over the course of the next 12 months. And if they are only looking on a 12-month period, then that doesn't reflect very well on the people involved. And certainly my understanding is that's not the case. There is more pressure on the club to get into the Champions League, and if they have missed out on one season. But I think one of their big sponsorship deals is with Adidas, and the way that goes is that if United fail to qualify for the Champions League 2 years consecutively, then there is a 25% reduction in what they receive from Adidas. So that's therefore, if you fail to qualify for 1 year, you're aware of that. And perhaps a transfer where the board of directors were wavering is more likely to go through, because they know that if they fail to sign that player, they're going to be losing out a substantial sum of money from Adidas in 12 months, as well as potentially the loss of Champions League money. And there's a lot, when you take a look at the way that money is distributed by UEFA, especially, there are lots of pots and coefficients and nerdiness around it, and qualifying for the Europa League or for a few years consecutively is not good for your UEFA coefficients, which impact upon the amount of money you actually receive in terms of prize money when you get to the Champions League.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear. I think I'll bring up this comment quickly from Hader. Hader, thanks for watching. I know, Kieran, you probably know Hader pretty well at this point, but it just sort of mirrors what the fans are thinking. I know you'll be thinking the same as well, Henry, that the ambitions of the fans don't match the ambitions of the owners, and it does look sort of commercial based. But I'll hand the floor to you, Henry. I know you've got a lot to say. So.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about. We've seen how much Chelsea have spent this year. Obviously, the transfer ban over the last couple of years, and how much City spend. They don't seem to offload a hell of a lot of players. So I was just wondering if you know when financial fair play starts to come into a situation. We've seen with City, they almost got done for it, and yet they go and spend 150 million this summer. So I was just wondering, Kieran, what kind of happens with financial fair play when this all kicks up?
Okay, well, let's take those clubs in turn. When it comes to Chelsea, Chelsea have generated more money than any club in the Premier League over the course of the last 5-6 years. And in fact, every single year between, I think, 2015 and 2019, Chelsea had the biggest sales of players. You think about Costa, Oscar, Hazard, and so on. So Chelsea have been able to invest in the market because actually they've been very good at selling players. And part of the Chelsea model is something which sort of goes below the radar as far as many fans are concerned. What Chelsea have a habit of doing is having an academy scheme and a recruitment scheme where they're picking up lots of players who nobody's ever heard of at relatively low fees. Or, of course, they brought them through they're selling them for low amounts. And it's 2 million here, it's 3 million here. They've got lots of players out on loan, and those loan agreements, again, you can pick up a 7-figure fee. When Tammy Abraham was on loan at Swansea, I think was it Villa as well? Was it Derby? I've forgotten which. But when he was out on loan, Chelsea gets substantial loan fees on the back of that. So Chelsea have spent money this summer, but remember, in 2019 they were also subject to a transfer ban as a result of a breach of other FIFA regulations. So what we have seen this summer is two things. First of all, they qualified for the Champions League, which has an impact because the Champions League is effectively gets 80% of UEFA's prize money compared to 20% in Europa League. So that was a positive from their point of view. And also, they were effectively spending 2 years' worth of transfer spending in one summer as a result of the transfer ban, which took place in 2019. But when we come to Manchester City, Manchester City sold Leroy Sané, and other players and David Silva has gone from the club as well. So so a lot of wages have disappeared off the wage bill. Manchester City didn't spend a lot of money in 2019 and 2019-20, and the reason for that is because they knew that they were up on a charge from UEFA in terms of issues to do with financial fair play, or they were potentially going to be up on an issue, and therefore they wanted to be cautious in 2019-20 just in case they lost the ruling. They got a ban from Europe, and what they didn't want to be in the situation of is having spent a huge amount of money on players in 2019-20 who would either be unhappy as a result of the UEFA ban, or City themselves would have been in a bit of a financial pickle because the Champions League is worth, normally a minimum, say for a club of City stature, normally sort of 70 to 80 million. If you get to the final and win it can be worth double that. You can be talking 150 million. So you take that away from any business, and they can be worse off. So City didn't spend in 2019-20 to the same extent because they were aware of potential issues arising from this summer onwards. Having overturned UEFA's verdict at the Court for Arbitration for Sport, This effectively meant they knew that they were going to be playing in Europe for the foreseeable future, assuming that they finish in the top four, and therefore their budget increased on the back of that.
Yeah, I was just going to lead on to another point about Brighton, actually. We've seen their own up-and-coming side this year. And I was just going to talk about the ownership and kind of, I guess, the differences between the ownership of them and other clubs, because I obviously used to live down there. I remember I had a season ticket at one point in 2008, I think it was, when they were in League One. And we've seen the kind of, I'd say, meteoric rise of the club over the last 10, 12 years, especially under Tony Bloom. So what do you make of his model, and how far do you think they can go?
Well, I mean, I've got to declare an interest here. If the listeners aren't aware, I've been watching Brighton since 1973. I've got season tickets. Tony Bloom's model, I think, is about as much as you could hope for in terms of getting things right for a club of the size of Brighton Hove Albion. He bought the club. He immediately started to invest in infrastructure, and for people who aren't familiar with the story, Brighton lost their ground due to ownership issues. I think it's the politest way of describing it. We ended up playing at Gillingham for a couple of years. We then rented a local athletics track, and we could only get 6, 7, 8,000 people attending. It's a horrible place to play football from in the winter. There's no cover whatsoever. So Tony Bloom came in. And his first thing was the focus was on getting planning permission for a new stadium. When that was achieved, the stadium was built. It was built to a very high specification. If anybody's been there as an away fan, they'll tell you, the seats are bigger, they're more comfortable, the way that the catering facilities, they're very accessible, and so on. So everything was thought through. Then there was a huge amount invested in the training facilities as well, because they wanted to have something to attract players. And on the back of that, they were promoted to the Premier League. This is now their 4th season in the Premier League. I think it's a very, very smart model. It's acknowledging where you are in the football hierarchy, and we are a non-six team. We're not a big team. Whose first ambition every season is to avoid relegation, and second ambition is to improve the quality of the football and the ability of the club to progress within the Premier League. So they've achieved all of their objectives. It's still a struggle. The club is losing still 20, 30, 40 million pounds a year, despite being in the Premier League, and I think that just shows you how tough it is. But I think they're still, COVID certainly isn't helping. But the aim, I think, is to break even at some point through having a player development model, which they're starting to see. And players have, people such as Ben White, very high profile, Tariq Lamptey, Stephen Alzate, and so on, have come through either being spotted as bargains or have come through the academy scheme or the development scheme. So it was a long-term strategy. Get the infrastructure right, then invest in the players. On the back of that, get promoted, and try to move on a season by season basis. And in my view, that's been achieved.
Anything else, Emery, before we move on?
No, that's I wanted to talk about that for a little bit.
Right, well, you sort of brought us nicely onto our next point then. It's just looking at the Premier League as a whole. So we'll start with the obvious one in Chelsea. Now, I know you touched on it briefly, but they have spent a lot more than anyone else in Europe this summer. That's been widely reported. And now there's obviously a big part of it down to the transfer ban last year. But, despite the ban, they still, activated the clause to buy Kovacic for what was reportedly about 45 million. They still bought Christian Pulisic in the January before for a big fee. So to go out and spend, sort of double at least what anyone else has spent in Europe, there's obviously got to be something going on behind the scenes money-wise that they are clearly thriving in. They brought in Marina. I don't know her last name. It's it's a hard thing to say, but their
Yeah.
sort of sporting director who's responsible for getting a lot of money from players who Chelsea don't want anymore. So are they just sort of really utilising her and her abilities, or is it something else?
Chelsea are very good at selling players, as we've already discussed. But they had an advantage over Manchester United, over Liverpool, over many other clubs, in the sense that Roman Abramovich is not only wealthy, and there's many wealthy owners in the Premier League. He's wealthy, and he is willing to put more and more money into the club. So, if you take a look at their last accounts, he's put in around about £1,400 million into Chelsea, and the Chelsea company structure is messy. There's Chelsea FC PLC, and there's clubs, there's companies that own that. So you have to do a bit of a crumb trail to work out exactly where the money is due to and from. But there has been a report put out, I think this week, in fact, that the uber wealthy on the planet have done extremely well out of COVID because of the nature of many of their businesses. So whilst you and I, appreciate you guys are at university, you're probably looking at the job market when you graduate and thinking, well, that's not looking great. And I'm at university as well, and we're concerned about student welfare and student prospects as well as our own in terms of the future. Roman Abramovich sold one of his businesses over the course of the summer for £1.5 billion. And on the back of that, he bought himself Munch's The Scream, one of the most iconic paintings of all time. Spent over £100 million on that. And he says, "Well, I've still got over £1 billion to mess around with. Tell you what, Frank, is it 250 million? Go away and have a bit of fun." And it was as simple as that. Roman Abramovich wants Chelsea to succeed, and he's in the ability to influence that success by funding the way that the club operates in the transfer market. From a cash point of view, the player sales that Chelsea have managed to generate over the course of recent years have allowed them to stay within financial fair play, and also being regular appearances in the Champions League, which is financially beneficial as well.
Well, just sort of going to the other end of the spectrum, then, a club who is a big club who's not famous for really spending money. Arsenal have made the news recently with the signing Aubameyang to a bumper contract. There's famously Mesut Ozil was on over 300 grand a week. Now they let reportedly 55 staff leave this summer. They made him redundant, but then went on to have one of the biggest transfer windows in a while in bringing in Thomas Partey and William Saliba in from the end of his loan. So just sort of what's gone on there behind the scenes to make, what's gone on in the owner's head to make it rational that they've let so many people go and yet spent so much?
I think the redundancy issue is just a classic example of how not to manage a reputation of a business, to do that so soon after winning the FA Cup, which of course gave them participation in the Europa League, which is worth potentially 30 to 40 million. Just seems a hand-fisted decision. Now it could be that there are genuine operational reasons for making those redundancies take place. I think Arsenal's scouting and recruitment model has changed over the course of the last year or so. I think Arteta has probably got a different idea on how he wants to receive and analyse data in relation to players, which meant that jobs were potentially going to go. But it looks awful. It looks as if the club is very uncaring. And clearly the Gunnosaurus story, which has got an element of amusement about it. It's still one person losing their job. So that's terrible news from an individual perspective. What we have seen in relation to Arsenal from a business perspective is that silent Stan Kroenke, the club's owner, who famously never seemed to get involved in anything to do with the club, I think he has delegated some responsibility for Arsenal to his son, who is very keen on Arsenal. And therefore, I think they've been willing to loosen the purse strings as well. I think the club is conscious that it was in danger of becoming detached from the so-called Big Six. If you take a look at Arsenal's wage bill, we've said that they spent a lot of money this year. Actually, Arsenal's wage bill is substantially lower than that of Liverpool, Manchester United, Manchester City, and Chelsea. Still higher than that of Spurs, but I think Spurs' wage bill is going to increase substantially. Certainly with Mourinho around, we all know he's no stranger to spending other people's money. So Arsenal had a lot of catching up to do, and I don't think they could afford to let Aubameyang go. He was in an incredibly strong position from a negotiating point of view, because to replace him, you're talking, a player of his quality. It would cost of the club £60 million to get a grade A striker of Aubameyang. So his representatives will have gone to the club and said, instead of spending £60 million on a player, why don't you just give Pierre a decent pay rise, and he's willing to stay? And everyone's a winner. Arsenal have kept an iconic player. The fans are happy because that they know how good Aubameyang is, and of course the player and his representatives will have had substantial increases in their income. So that's why that particular contract was signed. And Arsenal, as I say, I think it's important for them that they do finish, top 4, top 5, whatever it's going to be, in order to be relevant to sponsors and to commercial partners and all of this rubbish business type of football, which we as fans really don't want to become associated with. But it does generate income streams which can then be invested into the playing side of the club.
Now, Henry, I know you like a rant, so this is probably going to be your platform for it. I can imagine you feel pretty strongly about the way Arsenal have dealt with things. So, is any sort of opinions that you want to share or talk about?
Well, to be honest, I didn't really realize we were going to delve into the personal side of things, but fair enough. I guess it's more difficult to take if you're an Arsenal fan, that your owner's willing to cut jobs to get players in. And obviously they say, the big thing for me is they say that COVID's had a massive impact and they have to cut jobs and whatever, and then they go and sign a player reportedly on £260,000 a week. I don't think he's helped himself, Kroenke particularly. It seems to be his son that kind of has taken the reins at Arsenal. It's frustrating as a football fan, and I can't say I'm massively emotional about it, because again, it's not something particularly personal to me. But in terms of Arsenal fans, I'm sure they're pretty fuming at what the club have done. Although saying that, to be honest, at the end of the day, people look for the football side of things, and it sounds horrible, but I think those redundancies and stuff will be forgotten, not quickly, but they will be forgotten in time, as opposed to you're in the now with the football side of things. But I think it's morally wrong, but as Kieran mentioned, business and morals probably don't come into the same sentence usually. So I don't think the owners really care, to be honest.
Fair enough. I'll leave it at that then. So just moving on then, the last club we were going to talk about, unless Henry wants to add anything after, was obviously City and their FFP case. Now, they were punished in a sort of trying to think of the words, but they were punished and then it was taken back. So it was very confusing as a fan, especially of a club that could have benefited from them not being in the Champions League. So, Kieran, would you mind just sort of explaining the details around the case and then how it came to be that they didn't get punished at all?
Okay, the accusation that was levelled at Manchester City was that they had signed some commercial deals, mainly with companies based in Abu Dhabi, where clearly the owners are based. And those deals where City were receiving, let's say, £6 or £7 million from the sponsor directly, and then they were receiving another £50 or £60 million from the club owners who were pretending to be the sponsors, in effect. And this formed the basis of UEFA's charges. Now, the evidence for UEFA's charges came from a series of emails which were obtained through the Football League's vehicle, and it looks as if UEFA didn't get any backup evidence to support those emails. Certainly, looking at the publication from CAS, the Court for Arbitration for Sport, that they felt that evidence was sufficient to warrant both the 2-year exclusion from UEFA competition and the €30 million fine. So that formed the basis for UEFA's case. That went to the what's referred to as the Judicatory Committee at UEFA, and a decision was made. UEFA is a very political organisation, so you can understand perhaps why it happened, but in hindsight, it probably didn't help UEFA's case when it came for the Court for Arbitration for Sport, that a number of other clubs in the Premier League had written to UEFA saying, well, we think City should get banned, in effect, because everybody operates in self-interest. And if you are Arsenal and Chelsea and Liverpool and so on, having Manchester City not qualifying for the Champions League, of course, increases the chance of your club qualifying. So it looks as if UEFA were... City said that they were effectively the judge, the jury, and the prosecutor in relation to this. And I think that's perhaps a little bit harsh. The adjudicatory committee were in fact independent of Manchester City. So that formed the basis of the initial punishment, the initial tariff. City appealed, which they're entitled to do. This went to the Court for Arbitration for Sport, which is there to reduce costs, although I'd hate to think what the actual legal costs were on this particular item, and B, to speed up the process in respect to sports disputes. The conclusion reached by CAS was twofold. First of all, and UEFA were a bit daft here. First of all, that some of the evidence was in fact out of date. Under UEFA's own constitution, if you are making a prosecution, then you've got to use data within the last 5 years. So some of the evidence was in fact deemed to be time barred, not due to CAS but due to UEFA's own constitution. And then the remaining evidence was deemed to be insufficient to warrant finding City guilty. And if you take a look at CAS, and I think this is something which has been ignored to a large extent by many commentators, is that it wasn't a unanimous decision. That there are 3 very learned people sitting on the CAS committee at any one time. 2 people decided that UEFA's initial punishment was too harsh, and therefore should have been reversed, and therefore it went from 2 years to nothing, and the fine was reduced from €30 million to €10 million. The third judge, or whatever you want to call him, the third arbiter at CAS, said, "No, I'm actually happy with the initial verdict, but clearly on a majority decision basis, the initial tariff was changed, and Manchester City are now entitled to participate in the Champions League for the foreseeable future." And that's how justice works. So people saying, "Well, it isn't just," that is how courts and systems work. At the end of the day, the highest authority as far as decisions of this nature are concerned made that final verdict, and the decisions which were made by effectively lower courts were overruled.
Now, just one more thing before I hand over to Henrik, because I know he'll probably have some questions for you as well. But the thing that I'm interested in specifically with City is they've obviously got the City group, haven't they? They've got a lot of clubs that are very well connected. Obviously, the ones that come to mind, I think, are Girona in Spain, and then New York City in America. Now, how are City utilising these clubs to the best of their ability, both on the pitch and financially? And how does any other club sort of go about building the same model if it's sustainable?
I think the nature of the model is an intriguing one. It allows a player development model that in Manchester City find a promising player who they're not convinced will get into the City's first team squad this year. That player could effectively be parked at one of the other members of the City football group. It allows them to have certain centralised costs spread over a number of clubs paying for those costs. If you take a look at the number of employees at Manchester City Football Club compared to its peer group, compared to Liverpool, Manchester United, and so on, City employ far fewer people because they're effectively employed by City Football Group. So that means that the accusation that's made is that certain costs are being borne elsewhere rather than being borne by Manchester City. It allows them to be smart or cute. I'm not here to say the thing is I try to avoid the morality-based issues. But in terms of the transfer market, so if you take a look at the case of Aaron Moy, he's an Australian player playing for Melbourne City. He was effectively given what appears to be the equivalent of a free transfer to Manchester City Football Club, who immediately put him out on loan and then sold him to Huddersfield Town. I think they sold him for in the region of 9 to 10 million. So instead of Melbourne City making a big profit, Manchester City Football Club made a big profit. That counts towards financial fair play, and that's business. That's, people will say, well, that's actually a smart way of ensuring you don't exceed the financial fair play limits. So the nature of the City Group, that they've got a sponsorship agreement with Puma that covers the whole of the organisation. That makes it quite attractive to Puma itself because it gets their shirts. They're sort of to a certain extent, quite a common brand in terms of merchandise and things of this nature across the globe. If Manchester City want to go on a pre-season tour, they can play in New York because they know that they've already got a partner there. So globalization in football, it works to a certain extent in things of this nature. The big fear is that City now own clubs. They don't own Girona itself. I think they've got 44% of Girona. Pep Guardiola's brother owns quite a big proportion of the club, I think, as well. I'm not sure about that. They now own a club in France, a club in Belgium. In terms of the integrity of the game, and we still like to believe in I think most people think that there's a lot of integrity in the game, although I can't say to air, but I'm aware of some countries in Europe where I know the results of the match before they're kicked off. I say no more than that. But there is integrity to it. I think a lot of the time, what happens when Manchester City potentially could end up playing another member of the City Football Group in a Champions League game or something of that nature. Now, it's not arisen to date. Certainly, there were issues with the RB Group when two teams were drawn together. So, if this thing is going to take place more and more, and in a post-Brexit world, that could be the case, because recruiting players from the European Union is going to be more of a challenge for clubs. So perhaps having a partner club on the mainland in continental Europe is beneficial. Certainly my club, Brighton, Tony Bloom owns a club in Belgium, and players from Brighton end up going on loan now. That from a business point of view makes a lot of sense. we'll have to see. There are certainly benefits though in the multi-club ownership model, and I'm aware of potential new owners of football who see this as the way forwards.
Yeah, it's interesting you say. I think we lost Henry. He's been having internet problems, so hopefully we can get him back. But it's an interesting model that you can make because, like you say, there is the financial benefit and the footballing benefit of it that you can send your younger players on loan to get some experience. Especially in City's case, they've got a very good standard of team. Obviously, Girona in the in and around the sort of the top division in Spain. The MLS is growing all the time in quality, so that improves them. But yeah, it's definitely something I'm sort of envious as a United fan. But I think we'll move on to the next bit then if we can't get Henry back. So wanted just to sort of round off the show by talking about how teams in Europe have been hit by the COVID situation, because obviously United only got the Van der Beek deal over the line because Madrid pulled out because of financial issues. There's been no big spending across Europe from the Titans such as sort of PSG and Barcelona. Now, I know you could say that they signed Pjanic for 70 million, but that was only because of the sale of Arthur the other way. So, the net spend of these teams is pretty small. Even Bayern Munich, bringing in Leroy Sané and then getting quite a bit of their money back through the sale of Thiago. So, what's sort of going on in Europe that we're not really seeing? Because the Premier League teams are still seem to be spending big. So we know there's a financial gap between England and the rest of Europe in terms of TV money and stuff like that. But what is actually going on behind the scenes at Europe that's led to this sort of situation?
Well, I think James, you've actually highlighted this. To me, that there's two issues. First of all, there's, you correctly identified, the Premier League TV deal is vastly bigger than that of any other country in Europe. And when you take, all football clubs have got three sources of income: match day, commercial, and broadcasting. So if all the clubs in Europe are losing their match day income, and I appreciate that in Germany restricted crowds are being allowed because they seem to have dealt with COVID a lot better than we have. And that's not a political comment. That's just factually accurate. Then if you lose match day income, and it's a much bigger proportion of your overall income than it is here in the UK, then you're going to have to make cutbacks. So if we take a look at the Premier League, overall, about £1 in every 7 comes through the turnstiles. In continental Europe, it's much higher. So therefore, they've been hit proportionally much harder than the clubs in the Premier League. So that's the first reason for the significant reduction. And I think we're talking a third to a 40% or more in some countries of a reduction in the transfer market spend. The second reason is issues that we've actually touched on during the course of this chat, and that is the fact that we have here in England different ownership models. So Barcelona and Real Madrid are both fan-owned clubs. If you take a look at clubs in Germany, they've got the 50+1 rule, which prevents or discourages third-party ownership of football clubs. And therefore, on the back of that, it makes it more difficult to raise money. Now, as we said earlier, Roman Abramovich just decided, I'll give you a couple of £100 million to spend in this summer's transfer market, Frank. And they went and did it. Manchester City have got the backing of Abu Dhabi. So therefore, if you've got wealthy owners, you're in a much stronger financial position. But if you take a look at the Premier, people talk about the Premier League as if all the clubs are the same. But that isn't the case. Between them, if you take Burnley, Brighton, Crystal Palace, Southampton, West Ham, their collective net spend was less than £10 million. So what we have in the Premier League is the gap between rich and poor, the gap between those who can spend and those who can't spend. That gap has grown hugely as a result of COVID-19.
just sort of one more thing on that now. So we've got Henry back as well, so I'll bring him.
Sorry, my Sky Wi-Fi is borderline useless down here.
That's all right. Well, just before I ask this question, then I'll let Henry have the floor. Just sort of going back to the Premier League stuff, then, just obviously because he dropped out. So Henry, go ahead.
What were you talking about? Sorry, I didn't hear any of that.
we did move on to Europe, but I know you had a few questions about the Premier League's finances. So if you wanted to ask him, then go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I have one question, and that's about actually about Newcastle this time, and Mike Ashley's sort of ownership of the club. First of all, I wanted to ask, does he actually make any money out of the club? And secondly, there seems to be a takeover deal every year. Is there any sort of financial benefit? Because obviously they never go through. Is there any sort of financial benefit for him if there's, I don't know, rumours of a takeover, or does it mean he has to spend less on the club? Or I don't quite know, but it seems to be quite frustrating for a lot of fans. That
if we take a look at those two questions in turn, does he make any money out of the club? No. I mean, Mike Ashley has actually lent Newcastle United Football Club £111 million interest-free. So from that point of view, he's not making money out of the club. However, Newcastle fans, when you speak to them, they would say, well, hold on. If you take a look at merchandise, the Newcastle United megastore is the equivalent of a Sports Direct shop, so he could be making money out of that. There's perimeter advertising. There has been I think Newcastle United owned a piece of land which was then acquired by a Mike Ashley company, which has now been sold. Yeah, so he might have made some money from that. It all gets a bit murky, but I would say in the main, he's probably not made money out of Newcastle, because if you're lending money interest free, then the club's actually saving money in terms of what he'd normally expect to pay there. And he did inherit a club which, from a financial point of view, in my opinion, had been run not particularly well. I think the issue that Newcastle United fans have is that the investment in the playing squad has been very low, and certainly, especially if you take a look at the first 7 years of his ownership of the club, I think they worked out an average net spend of around about £800,000 a year, which is crazily low by Premier League standards. Newcastle is a fantastic city. I mean, I've been there, certainly as an away fan, and been there for nights out and things of that nature. So I love Newcastle as a city, and it's a very passionate city in terms of its own identity and its place within the Northeast. Being run by a Cockney, and initially having the likes of Dennis Wise being involved, and I don't know whether you've ever seen the Kevin Keegan legal case verdict in full. You go through the small print. That doesn't necessarily reflect particularly well on the club, as in terms of being a beacon for the Northeast, and that further irritates Newcastle United fans, and has contributed towards the breakdown in relationship. In terms of the second question, is there a financial benefit to Mike Ashley of deals not going through? Not really, because he has to incur costs when he's trying to sell the club, and if the deal falls down, he's still got to go and pay those accountants and lawyers and so on. So he would be losing out money there. It looks as if, in terms of the most recent deal, which is the prospective sale to the Saudi Arabia PIF, the Public Investment Fund, that some form of deposit was actually paid for the club of around about £15 million. Now, if that deposit is non-refundable, then yes, he could have made money out of that. Mike Ashley is now suing on behalf, or rather Newcastle United are now trying to sue the Premier League for, in their view, trying to delay the deal and make things so awkward that the prospective buyers pulled out. So it will be interesting to see how that particular court case develops. But overall, I don't think it will be a financial success for him, unless he manages to sell the club in excess. If he gets £300 million for it, then he will have done okay. I think he spent around about 140, 150 million buying it. He's lent it 110. So yes, he could make a return upon the final sale, but he needs to sell the club before he'll make a genuine profit from the transaction.
Henry, anything to add before we move on?
No, I think that was perfect. Thank you.
Now, just sort of bringing it back around to Europe then, obviously you said about the way clubs are run in Europe and how that's affected them, but we've seen with PSG, they're running what seems to be a very similar way to City, where they're run by a very rich person who then, helps them a lot financially. Now, they've had a very, very quiet summer by their standards. So has there been any sort of outside impact on them, or is it just similar to every other club in Europe in that they're not getting the money that they once had?
I just don't think there were any deals that particularly attracted them to making signings. Do you need to spend a fortune when you've just come out of a season where you've won your domestic league and you've made it to the final of the Champions League? Liverpool, if you think about Liverpool for 2018-19, they were fairly similar. They won the Champions League. They were runners up to City in what was that amazing season. But they didn't invest much money in 2019-20 because they're actually quite happy with the settled squad.
That's fair enough then. Henry, any questions about sort of big European teams?
Well, to be fair, I don't think there's a hell of a lot obviously gone on this year in terms of spending. PSG have probably been one of the big spenders. I wanted to ask a quick question about Barca actually. There seems to be something going wrong, obviously, with the board and stuff. What were the financial impacts this year for them? Because we've seen they haven't spent much money. They've had to sell players to bring players in. Would you say that COVID's probably been affected them the most?
Yeah, they actually published their accounts a few days ago, and then they were terrible. Absolutely terrible. They lost over €100 million in 2019-20. Their debt has shot up. I think they're now trying to force through compulsory wage cuts, which could be a challenge for them, although Spanish law is a bit more compliant than UK employment law. Barcelona have been very much hit because they've got a huge stadium. So therefore on match day they make a lot of money. People aren't going to the club shops. People aren't attending the club museum. And you add those things together towards a club which already had a pretty challenging wage bill to have to deal with, then Barcelona simply, they can't spend because they don't have an Abramovich, they don't have a Mansour, they don't have a Qatari investment authority to just say, don't worry guys, we can help out from a cash flow point of view. But Barcelona's finances are very challenging at present.
I think unless Henry's got anything to add, I think we'll call it a day there. Henry, you got anything?
No, that was ideal. I just wanted to kind of figure out where every other club's at in regards, obviously, to the top clubs and what's happening to them. So, but yeah.
Well, on that note, then we'll call it a day. Kieran, thank you so much for joining us. It was really appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Been a really interesting episode. So thanks for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All the best, guys. Stay safe.
And Henry, as always, thanks for joining me. And
apologies for my Wi-Fi thing. Nightmare. Yeah, it happens. Oh well.
That's all right. But yeah, we'll hopefully see you midweek for another episode. And yeah, thanks for watching.
Cheers.